Chapter 1. Introduction. Germany's Dream of a Place in the Sun. When we think of colonial powers today, names like Great Britain, France, or perhaps Spain and Portugal immediately come to mind. Germany, on the other hand, is often mentioned later, and there is a reason for this. The German Reich entered the race for colonies late and lost them just as quickly. But for a few decades, between the 1880s and the First World War, Germany actually had its own colonial empire. It included areas in Africa, such as Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, or German East Africa, but also distant island groups in the Pacific. These colonies were not huge countries like India was to Britain. They were small, scattered, and at first glance insignificant. But for the German Empire, they had an enormous symbolic significance. They were the expression of the claim to finally be a world power. The late start. While Great Britain and France had been building colonies for centuries, Germany held back for a long time. Before the founding of the German Empire in 1871, there was no unified German empire that could have acquired colonies at all. Although German merchants, missionaries, and explorers had contacts all over the world at an early stage, a politically united Germany simply did not exist. Suddenly, Germany was a major European power, strong in industry and the military, but without any colonies worth mentioning. For many politicians, journalists, and business leaders, this was a flaw. A place in the sun. The famous German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was skeptical at first. For him, stability in Europe and securing the unity of the empire were in the foreground. He saw colonies as expensive, unsafe, and ultimately not necessary. But over time, the mood changed. The German economy was booming, industry was looking for new markets and raw materials, and one nationalist colonial association after another was growing in the public eye. Newspapers wrote of Germany's fate as a world power. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who came to power in 1888, was ultimately the one who poured this dream into a political program. He spoke of a place in the sun that Germany must also claim, and colonies were the visible sign of this. The Pacific as a stage. While Africa was the obvious place for expansion for the major colonial powers, Germany also looked to the Pacific. There were small but strategically important island groups here, which until then had often only been loosely controlled by Spain, by local rulers, or not at all. The Pacific has long been interesting for German merchants. They traded copra, dried coconut meat, phosphates, and other raw materials. Missionaries had founded churches and schools. German ship owners were looking for bases for trade between Asia and Australia. So it was no coincidence that the first German colonies in the Pacific were established right here. More symbol than substance. From an economic point of view, the German colonies in the Pacific were never particularly important. They supplied raw materials and offered trading posts, but they were small and expensive to manage. But politically, they had an enormous value. For the German Reich, they were proof that it was no longer just a European power, but an empire that hoisted its flag in all the world's oceans. Prelude to a story. In the following chapters, we will see how these colonies came into being, how they were administered, how the native population reacted to the Germans, and why they were lost so quickly in the end. The German colonies in the Pacific are almost forgotten today, but their story tells a lot about German imperialism, about the rivalry between the world powers, and about the dream of being part of the great game of power and prestige. Chapter 2. The First Steps, Trade Bases and Missionaries. Before the German Reich officially had colonies in the Pacific, Germans had long been present there. Traders, adventurers, missionaries, and seafarers had already established close contacts with the island worlds between New Guinea, Samoa, and the Marshall Islands in the 19th century. These early steps laid the foundation for what would later become the colonial empire. German merchants in the South Seas. The German economy was in full bloom in the 19th century. The Hanseatic cities of Hamburg and Bremen in particular were international trading centers. Merchants looked for new markets and raw materials, and found plenty of them in the Pacific. Particularly important was copra, the dried pulp of the coconut. This was used to extract oil, which was used in Europe for soaps, lamps, and later also for margarine. Trading houses such as J.C. Godefroy & Zone from Hamburg founded branches in Samoa and made the islands an important center of German South Sea trade. Other companies soon followed, including the powerful New Guinea Company. Missionaries and their role. In addition to the merchants, the missionaries also came. From the middle of the 19th century, German missionary societies, especially from Saxony and Württemberg, sent preachers to the South Seas. Their goal was to convert the local population to Christianity. They founded schools, translated the Bible into local languages, and brought Western education, but also strict rules and the rejection of many local traditions. The missionaries played a double role. On the one hand, they protected some communities from exploitation by traders, and on the other hand, they prepared the ground for colonial structures by conveying European values. Adventurers and travelers. The South Seas also exerted a magical attraction on explorers and travelers. Naturalists such as Adalbert von Chamisso or later Georg von Schleinetz reported on exotic plants, animals, and cultures. Their reports aroused curiosity and pride in Germany. For many readers in Europe, the South Seas were a paradise, a place of untouched nature and noble savage. Such romantic ideas strengthened the desire to gain influence there. A web of influence. Even before the empire founded colonies, German traders and missionaries had built up a network of contacts and bases. In Samoa, German merchants soon dominated the export of copra. Trading posts established the first bases on the Marshall Islands. In New Guinea and on neighboring islands, the New Guinea Company secured huge lands. This network was the basis on which the later colonial empire grew. From trade to politics. For a long time, these activities remained privately organized. Traders and missionaries worked on their own account, without direct support from the state. But with the founding of the German Empire in 1871, that changed. The merchants demanded protection from the German Navy. The missionaries wanted state support. And soon, economic influence turned into political demand. Transition to imperialism. This is the beginning of the path from trade to colony. What began with merchants and preachers led to the official proclamation of German possessions in the Pacific in the 1880s. And it was here that German politics appeared on the scene for the first time, at first hesitantly under Bismarck, then with full force under Wilhelm II. Chapter 3. Kaiser Wilhelm and Colonial Policy. When the German Empire was founded in 1871, the colonial question was not yet on the agenda. Reich Chancellor Otto von Bismarck thought little of colonies. For him, the balance of power in Europe and the security of the empire counted. Overseas territories seemed to him to be costly adventures. But in the 1880s, the situation changed. Traders, ship owners, missionaries, and politicians began to exert pressure. They demanded state protection for their interests in the Pacific and Africa. Bismarck's hesitation. Bismarck was a realist. He knew that colonies were expensive and doubted whether Germany would benefit economically enough from them. Nevertheless, he could no longer resist the growing colonial movements in his own country forever. The German Colonial Association, founded in 1882, and later the German Colonial Society, massively promoted colonies. Newspapers stirred up national enthusiasm. The bourgeoisie saw colonies as a sign of grandeur and modernity. So it came about that in 1884, Bismarck reluctantly recognized the first German protectorates, including those in the Pacific. The role of Wilhelm II. With the accession to the throne of Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1888, colonial policy received new momentum. Unlike Bismarck, Wilhelm dreamed of a role as a world power. He wanted the German Reich to be visibly present on all oceans. His famous phrase about the place in the sun became the leitmotif. Colonies were no longer just economic projects, but symbols of prestige, power, and national pride. The New Guinea Company. A major player in the Pacific was the New Guinea Company, a half-private, half-state-backed company. In 1884, it received the right from the imperial government to exercise sovereign rights in the northeastern part of New Guinea and on some islands. This officially marked the beginning of Germany's engagement in the Pacific. Private trading bases now became protected areas of the Reich. Rivalry with other powers. Germany entered the colonial race late and had to hold its own against established powers such as Great Britain, France, and the USA. In Samoa, there were bitter disputes between Germany, Great Britain, and the USA until the islands were finally divided in 1899. In the Caroline Islands, Germany fought with Spain before buying the archipelago in 1899. In the Marshall Islands, German traders pushed back British competitors and secured supremacy in 1885. The Pacific was thus a scene of imperial rivalries in which the young empire fought for recognition. Symbolic power, limited reality. For Germany, the colonies in the Pacific were less a question of profit. They were, above all, prestige projects. Although they supplied copra, phosphates, and other raw materials, these quantities were small compared to German industrial production. Much more important was that Germany was able to show that it was a power, even in the distance. Prelude to the real colonies. With this policy, Wilhelm II laid the foundation for what was later called the German colonial empire in the Pacific. From New Guinea to Samoa to the Marshall Islands, the black-white-red flag soon flew. But what did it look like there in concrete terms? Which islands really belonged to the empire, and how were they administered? We will see this in the next chapter, with the crown jewel of the German South Sea colonies, German New Guinea. Chapter 4. German New Guinea, the crown jewel in the Pacific. Among all the German colonies in the Pacific, German New Guinea played a special role. It was the largest, the most populous, and was considered the crown jewel of the German colonial empire in the South Seas. But the history of this area also exemplifies the problems and contradictions of German imperialism. First German presence. As early as the 1870s, German traders, especially the New Guinea Company, began to establish trading stations on the northeast coast of New Guinea and on neighboring islands. The region was rich in natural resources, tropical wood, coconuts, cocoa, and later phosphates. But initially, there was a lack of state support. Merchants asked the Reich government for protection, but for a long time met with restraint from Bismarck. It was not until 1884 that the German Reich officially declared the area a protected area. The area, German New Guinea, comprised the northeast of the main island of New Guinea, Kaiser Wilhelm's Land, the Bismarck Archipelago, New Pomerania, now New Britain, and New Mecklenburg, now New Ireland, other island groups such as the Admiralty Islands. Together, they formed a huge colony that made Germany more visible on the map of world powers. Administration by the New Guinea Company. Initially, the colony was not ruled directly by the empire, but by the New Guinea Company, a private company with quasi-state rights. It was allowed to conclude contracts, deploy police, and administer territories. In return, it was supposed to deliver economic profits. But the reality was different. The administration was weak, the profits low, the costs high. Soon, the state had to intervene more strongly. Conflicts with the population. For the local population, the German presence meant a radical break. Traders and colonial officials claimed land, often without regard for the existing structures. Forced labor on plantations was introduced. Traditional villages lost their autonomy. Resistance was harshly suppressed, sometimes with military force. Especially in the Bismarck Archipelago, there were repeated uprisings that were bloodily suppressed. Economic expansion. Despite all the difficulties, the Germans tried to develop the colony economically. Plantations for cocoa, coconuts, and rubber were established. German companies invested, built infrastructure such as small roads and ports. But compared to the hopes, the profits remained modest. Many projects failed due to climate, diseases, or a lack of manpower. Symbolic value. Despite all the problems, German New Guinea was a prestige object for the empire. Newspapers praised the colony as a sign of German world power. And for the Navy, it was an important base in the Pacific. The reality on the ground, however, was characterized by economic insecurity, conflicts with the population, and a constant lack of resources. Transition. German New Guinea is an example of how the German colonies in the Pacific came into being. Through private traders, then through state recognition, and finally through a mixture of economic exploitation and symbolic significance. But German New Guinea was not the only colony. Smaller island groups also played a role, especially the Marshall Islands, which we will look at in the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Marshall Islands. While German New Guinea was the crown jewel of the German South Sea colonies, the Marshall Islands played a rather small but not insignificant role. For German colonial policy, they were above all a strategic base and a symbol of the fact that the Reich could also fly the flag in the most remote corners of the world. Early contacts. The Marshall Islands were already a destination for European traders and missionaries in the 19th century. German merchants from Hamburg and Bremen in particular set up trading posts here to trade in copra. The coconut palms of the islands provided large quantities of copra, which was processed into oil in Europe. Soon, German companies, such as the German Trade and Plantation Company of the South Seas, controlled large parts of the trade. Missionaries and their role. As in other parts of the Pacific, missionaries played a major role in the Marshall Islands. They brought Christianity, founded schools, and tried to change the local culture. Tensions often arose between the traditional structures and the new religious rules. For Germany, the missionaries were useful because they indirectly paved the way for colonial rule. From trading station to colony. In the 1870s and 1880s, German interest grew. British and American traders were also active, and there was a risk that the islands could come under British control. Finally, in 1885, the German Empire declared the Marshall Islands a protected area. A German imperial commissioner was appointed to take over the administration. This meant that the islands were officially part of the German colonial empire. Administration and everyday life. The administration of the Marshall Islands was small and manageable. Only a few German officials were actually present on the islands. Everyday life was largely determined by the traders and missionaries. The local population was integrated into the colonial economy, especially through the production of copra. Many had to work under harsh conditions on the plantations. Strategic importance. Although the Marshall Islands were not very important economically, they had a strategic role. They were located in the middle of the Pacific and could serve as a stopover for ships. This was a useful point for the German Navy, even if it did not create a large naval base. Conflicts and problems. As everywhere in the German colonies, tensions arose in the Marshall Islands. Locals resisted the land grab, and there were conflicts over working conditions. The German administration tried to exert control with a mixture of harshness and civilization programs. But the reality was that although the islands officially belonged to the empire, they were de facto largely determined by the trading companies. Transition. The Marshall Islands are an example of how small, scattered, and yet symbolically important the German colonies in the Pacific were. They brought little profit, but they signaled Germany was there, even at the other end of the world. In the next chapter, we will turn to the Caroline Islands and Palau, groups of islands that Germany did not conquer but bought from Spain. Chapter 6. The Caroline Islands and Palau. While the Marshall Islands and New Guinea were opened up mainly by German traders and companies, the Caroline Islands and Palau came into German hands in a completely different way, namely through the purchase of Spain. The Caroline Islands and their location. The Caroline Islands are a widely scattered archipelago in Micronesia, consisting of hundreds of small atolls and islands. Together with Palau, they form a chain that lies between the Philippines and the Marshall Islands. Spain claimed the islands early on, but its effective control was weak. There were only a few missionaries and small bases. Spanish weakness. At the end of the 19th century, Spain was in crisis. The once huge world empire had shrunk. In America, almost all colonies had been lost. And after the Spanish-American War of 1898, Madrid also had to cede Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. All that remained were a few scattered islands in the Pacific, including the Caroline Islands and Palau. But Spain could no longer hold them effectively. Buying through Germany. In 1899, Spain finally offered the islands for sale. For Germany, this was an opportunity to expand its presence in the Pacific without having to wage war. For 25 million pesetas, the empire bought the Caroline Islands, Palau, and the Northern Mariana Islands. This significantly expanded the German South Sea colonies. Administration under German rule. The new territories were placed under the administration of German New Guinea. German officials set up small administrative stations, introduced taxes, and regulated trade. As elsewhere in the Pacific, the production of copra dominated. The local population was integrated into the plantation system, partly through forced labor, partly through dependence on trade. Strategic importance. For the German Empire, the Caroline Islands and Palau had above all strategic value. They were located on important sea routes in the Western Pacific, between Asia and the American possessions. Berlin hoped that the islands could serve as bases for trade and navy. Although no large naval bases were established, the presence alone strengthened Germany's role in the Pacific colonial game. Missionary work and cultural contacts. Spanish missionaries, especially Jesuits, had already been active before the Germans. The German administration adopted many of its structures, but also promoted Protestant missionaries from Germany. The local societies were profoundly changed as a result. Christianity, Western clothing, and new education systems displaced many traditional structures. Chapter 7. German Samoa. Of all the German colonies in the Pacific, Samoa was the best known and arguably the most prestigious. While New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, or the Caroline Islands served more as sources of raw materials and trading bases, Samoa was a symbol of colonial power and a place where Germany competed directly with Great Britain and the USA. Samoa before the colonial era. The Samoa Islands had long had contacts with Europeans. Whalers, traders, and missionaries came from the early 19th century. German merchants, especially the Hamburg company J.C. Godefroy and Sohn, built up a strong trading network here. Copra was also the most important export item in Samoa. Soon, German traders controlled most of the trade. At the same time, missionaries began to convert the population to Christianity, which changed the local society. The Samoa problem. But Samoa was not only interesting for the Germans. The British and the USA also claimed influence. All three powers supported different local chiefs and parties, which led to a veritable proxy war. The situation came to a dangerous head several times. In 1889, German, British, and American warships were on the verge of shooting at each other off Apia, the capital of Samoa. Only a typhoon, which destroyed several ships, prevented a direct battle. Distribution of the islands. The rivalry was not settled until 1899. In the so-called tripartite agreement, the great powers divided Samoa among themselves. The United States received the Eastern Islands, now American Samoa. Germany received the Western Isles, today the independent state of Samoa. Great Britain renounced Samoa, but was awarded other territories in the Pacific in return. With that, German Samoa was born. German administration. The Germans established a strict colonial administration. A governor was appointed, who was directly subordinate to the empire. Plantation economy was massively expanded, especially for copra and cocoa. In order to attract workers from other colonies, such as China and Melanesia, were also brought to Samoa. This led to social tensions between the local Samoans and the immigrant workers. Everyday life under German rule. The Samoans themselves experienced German rule ambivalently. On the one hand, the administration ensured a certain stability and the expansion of infrastructure. On the other hand, their political structures were severely restricted. The traditional chieftain system was deliberately controlled by the Germans in order to secure influence. Resistance was crushed, even though there was no major uprising like in Africa. Symbolic meaning. For the German Reich, Samoa was the prestige project in the Pacific. Newspapers regularly reported on the colony, and in Berlin, it was seen as proof that Germany had caught up with the old colonial powers. Samoa was also important internationally. Germany had successfully gained land here in direct competition with Great Britain and the USA. Transition. With Samoa, the German colonial empire reached its peak in the Pacific. But what was life actually like in all these colonies, for the few Germans on site and the large local population? We will clarify this in the next chapter when we dedicate ourselves to everyday life and society in the German Pacific colonies. Chapter 8: Society and Everyday Life in the Colonies. The German colonies in the Pacific were small and scattered, but they offered a fascinating picture of the coexistence of people from completely different worlds. In a few square kilometers, German officials, traders, missionaries, adventurers, and settlers met the local populations: Samoans, Melanesians, Micronesians, and workers from China or other parts of Oceania. The German presence. In contrast to Africa, very few Germans lived in the German colonies in the Pacific. In Samoa, for example, there were never more than a few hundred, and in New Guinea, even less. However, this small minority formed an upper class that determined economic and political life. Officials represented the Reich government, traders controlled the export of copra and cocoa, missionaries ran schools and churches. For the Germans, life in the South Seas was on the one hand adventurous and exotic, on the other hand often arduous. Tropical diseases, isolation, and difficult climatic conditions were part of everyday life. The local population. For the locals, the colonial period brought profound changes. Land was expropriated for plantations. Workers were used for plantation farming, sometimes forcibly. Traditional structures were monitored or restricted by the administration. In Samoa, for example, the Germans tried to use the chieftain system and control it at the same time. In New Guinea, on the other hand, direct confrontation occurred more frequently because many villages resisted the interventions of the Germans. Foreign workers and new societies. In many colonies, the local population alone was not enough to run the plantations. That is why foreign workers were recruited, especially from China, but also from Melanesia. These people often lived under poor conditions, hard work, low wages, hardly any rights. They formed their own stratum in the colonies, which stood between the few Germans and the native population. This gave rise to multi-ethnic societies that were characterized by sharp social hierarchies. Missionaries and schools. The missionaries played an important role in everyday life. They founded schools, translated Bibles, and introduced people to Western ways of life. For many locals, they were the first to provide access to reading and writing. But at the same time, they destroyed traditional religions and customs, banned dances, festivals, or spiritual rituals. For many communities, this was a massive cultural break. Everyday life, between adaptation and resistance. Life in the colonies was therefore a constant area of tension. Some locals worked with the Germans, traded with them, or used their schools. Others offered passive or active resistance, refused to work, or organized uprisings. The colonial era thus brought not only economic exploitation, but also a new social order that still leaves its mark today. Transition. Now that we have seen what daily life was like in the German colonies, we turn to a central aspect in the next chapter: missionary work and cultural contacts that had a lasting impact on the Pacific. Chapter 9: Mission and Cultural Contact. In addition to trade and administration, it was above all the missionaries who shaped the face of the German colonies in the Pacific. Their work had far-reaching consequences. They changed religion, education, language, and social structures, and thus brought a profound cultural change to the island worlds. The role of the mission. German missionaries often came to the South Seas before the officials and traders. Societies such as the North German Mission, the Neuendettelsau Mission, or Catholic orders sent their preachers to the most remote areas. They saw their task in converting pagans and carrying European civilization to the South Seas. Schools and churches were the most important tools of their work. Education and language. The missionaries introduced a Western education system. They taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, often in German, sometimes also in local dialects, into which they translated biblical texts. For many locals, this was their first encounter with formal education. Some later used the knowledge to act as interpreters, traders, or even as intermediaries between the colonial administration and the village population. Interventions in tradition and culture. But mission did not only mean education. It also brought with it the fight against traditional religions and customs. Ceremonies, dances, and festivals were banned. Polygamy, spiritual rituals, and ancestor worship were considered pagan. Christian moral concepts prevailed, with rules on marriage, sexuality, and education. For many communities, this was a radical break with their previous way of life. Cultural contact and hybrid cultures. Despite the massive interventions, hybrid crops also emerged. The people of the Pacific adapted Christian elements to their own traditions. This resulted in mixed forms of religion and culture that were neither purely European nor purely indigenous. An example: in Samoa, Christian values were combined with the existing chieftain system. The church became a central part of social life, but remained embedded in the local social order. Missionaries between protection and control. The role of the missionaries was ambivalent. On the one hand, they protected many locals from the worst exploitation by traders or colonial officials. On the other hand, they themselves contributed to oppression by destroying traditional structures and enforcing European norms. Some missionaries openly opposed colonial violence. Others worked closely with the administration. Long-term impact. The missionary work had profound consequences. To this day, many Pacific states are strongly influenced by Christianity. Schools that were originally founded by missionaries have remained part of the education system. At the same time, many traditional practices have been lost or marginalized. In this way, the mission shaped cultural change in the Pacific, perhaps more than any other colonial institution. Transition. While mission and cultural contacts changed life in the long term, the economic engine of the colonies was different: the plantation economy and the export of raw materials. In the next chapter, we will therefore devote ourselves to the economy and exploitation in the German Pacific colonies. Chapter 10: Economy and Exploitation. The colonies in the Pacific were never great gold mines for the German Reich. Compared to the African possessions, or even the colonial empires of Great Britain and France, they played only a minor economic role. But for the local merchants, plantation owners, and trading companies, they were of enormous importance. And for the local population, they often brought exploitation and forced labor. Copra, the white gold of the South Seas. The most important raw material of the German Pacific colonies was copra, the dried pulp of the coconut. Oil was extracted from copra, which was used in Europe for soaps, lamp oil, and margarine. The Marshall Islands, Samoa, and the Caroline Islands in particular became centers of copra production. German companies such as the German Trading and Plantation Company of the South Seas and the New Guinea Company controlled large parts of the trade. Other products. In addition to copra, other products were also exported: cocoa and rubber from New Guinea and Samoa, phosphates from smaller islands which were coveted as fertilizers in Europe. To a limited extent, there are also tropical woods and exotic plants. But copra remained the dominant product, so much so that the German presence in the Pacific was sometimes derided as the Copra Empire. Plantation economy. The German administration relied heavily on plantation farming. Land was expropriated and given to German companies. Local men and women worked on the plantations, often under harsh conditions. Since the local population was insufficient or refused, workers from China, Melanesia, and Micronesia were also recruited. Many came under false promises. Some were practically forcibly recruited. The working conditions were poor: long days in tropical heat, inadequate medical care, harsh penalties for violations. Domestic economy under pressure. The plantation economy displaced many traditional forms of economy. Village communities that had previously practiced subsistence farming now had to supply copra or other products for export. Taxes, which had to be paid in kind or in labor, forced many into the colonial economic system. Profits and reality. On paper, the colonies brought raw materials and markets for German goods. In reality, the profits were often small. Transportation and administration were expensive. Diseases, climate problems, and resistance from the population made the work difficult. Many plantations were unprofitable. But symbolically, the colonies remained important. They showed that Germany was participating in the global game of powers, exploitation and inequality. For the local population, economic policy meant above all exploitation. Loss of land, forced labor, and dependence on trade profoundly changed society. The social hierarchy became even sharper. At the top were the few Germans, including the Asian and Melanesian workers, and at the bottom were the native communities. The economic order of the colonies was therefore not a development aid project, as some contemporaries portrayed it, but a system that enriched the European minority at the expense of the majority. Transition. Where there is economic exploitation, resistance also arises. And indeed, there were protests, uprisings, and conflicts in the German Pacific colonies. In the next chapter, we will take a closer look at the resistance movements and conflicts. Chapter 11. Resistance and Conflict. Wherever colonial rule was established, it provoked not only adaptation, but also resistance. Even in the German colonies in the Pacific, this did not fail to materialize. Although the uprisings here were smaller and less well known than, for example, the Herero and Nama uprisings in German Southwest Africa, there were also protests, fighting, and violence in the Pacific. Causes of resistance. The reasons for conflicts were manifold. Land expropriations for plantations that destroyed traditional habitats. Forced labor and taxes that burdened the village communities. Missionary work that suppressed religious and cultural traditions. Humiliation by the colonial hierarchy, in which the locals had hardly any rights. Often, it was seemingly small triggers, a dispute over land, a misunderstanding with a trader, that sparked larger uprisings. New Guinea, a focal point of resistance. Especially in the Bismarck Archipelago, today Papua New Guinea, there were repeated uprisings. Villages attacked German plantations or trading posts, destroyed coconut plantations, and resisted forced labor. The German administration often reacted with harshness. Punitive expeditions of the colonial troops burned down villages, took hostages, or executed leaders. This was intended to force respect, but left deep wounds in the local population. Samoa, control instead of violence. In Samoa, German rule was less bloody. Here, the Germans tended to focus on controlling the political structures. They tried to manipulate the chieftain system and eliminate opponents. Nevertheless, tensions also arose in Samoa. Some chiefs did not accept German control and organized resistance, but in the form of political protest rather than military confrontation. Marshall Islands and Caroline Islands. There were also smaller uprisings on the Marshall Islands and the Caroline Islands. Especially in the Caroline Islands, villages repeatedly resisted the seizure of land by traders and missionaries. Here too, the German administration cracked down, with prison sentences, exiles, or military force. Asymmetrical power relations. Resistance was courageous, but usually without a chance. The Germans had modern weapons, ships, and organization. Small village communities could not hold their own in the long term. But the resistance showed that the population never simply accepted colonial rule. Beneath the surface, mistrust, rejection, and covert forms of protest remained, such as the refusal to work or the adherence to forbidden rituals. Significance of the conflicts. Even if the uprisings in the Pacific did not reach the same dimension as in Africa, they show that colonial rule was never peaceful. It was always based on coercion and violence, and where there was oppression, resistance also arose. Transition. But all these conflicts and structures came to an abrupt end. With the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the German colonies in the Pacific became the target of other powers and were lost within a few months. In the next chapter, we will take a look at the First World War and the end of the German colonies in the Pacific. Chapter 12. The First World War and the End of the Colonies. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the focus was immediately on the German colonies in the Pacific. They were small, weakly fortified, and surrounded by far stronger opponents. For the locals, this meant an abrupt change of power. For the German Reich, the loss of its places in the sun. Weak defense. The German Pacific colonies were hardly militarily secured. In New Guinea, there were only a few hundred colonial officials and policemen. Samoa had no garrison to speak of. The Marshall and Caroline Islands were even more sparsely occupied. Although the Imperial Navy was present in the Pacific, especially with the East Asia Squadron, it was too small to protect the islands permanently. The Allied powers intervene. For the Allies, especially Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, the German colonies were an easy target. As early as August 1914, New Zealand troops marched into Samoa without firing a shot. The few German officials surrendered without a fight. Australian troops landed in German New Guinea and occupied the most important bases within weeks. Here, too, the Germans offered only symbolic resistance. The Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands, and Palau were taken over by the Japanese Navy. A quick collapse. Within a few months, the entire German colonial empire in the Pacific was lost. Not a single area could be held. For the locals, life did not change radically immediately, but the colonial administration was now replaced by British, Australians, New Zealanders, or Japanese. It was a heavy blow for the empire, not militarily, but symbolically. The colonies had been prestige projects, and their loss showed how vulnerable the empire was outside Europe. The Treaty of Versailles. After the end of the war in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles stipulated that Germany would lose all its colonies. The Pacific territories became mandate territories of the League of Nations. New Zealand received Western Samoa. Australia received German New Guinea. Japan received the Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands, and Mariana Islands. This finally closed the chapter of the German colonies in the Pacific. Transition. With the loss of the colonies, Germany's presence in the Pacific almost completely disappeared. But what remained of this short episode? What memories do the affected island societies carry? And how did Germany later deal with this part of its history? We see this in the last chapter, Memory and Aftermath. Chapter 13, Memory and Aftermath. The German colonies in the Pacific existed for only a few decades, from the 1880s to 1914, but their traces reach into the present. For the island societies, these were years of far-reaching changes. For Germany, a short but symbolic period in the dream of a world power. Aftermath in the island societies. In many Pacific states, the German colonies are still visible today. Samoa remembers the German era as a phase of economic modernization, but also of political control. Street names and buildings from that era are still there. In Papua New Guinea, some German place names, e.g. Neu-Mecklenburg, or family names shape the memory. In the Marshall Islands and the Caroline Islands, the German traces are weaker, but here too, missions and administrative structures have left their mark. The missionaries, whose churches and educational systems still exist in many countries today, had the deepest impact. Remembrance in Germany. In Germany itself, the Pacific colonies are almost forgotten. While there is at least a broader debate about the colonies in Africa, the Pacific is often considered an exotic fringe. In the empire, however, the colonies played a major role in national propaganda. They were considered proof of the place in the sun. After the loss in 1919, they were glorified by colonial associations as stolen territories that would have to be brought back one day. After 1945, this colonial nostalgia disappeared, and the Pacific colonies were forgotten. Scientific reappraisal. In recent decades, historians have begun to research the German colonies in the Pacific in more detail. You ask, how severe was the exploitation really? What was the role of merchants, and administration? How did the islanders experience this time? Research shows more and more clearly that even in the small and often forgotten colonies, colonial violence, land grabbing, and forced labor were formative. Symbolism and doctrine. The German colonies in the Pacific were economically insignificant, but symbolically powerful. They stood for the striving for world power, which ultimately led to the First World War. For the island societies, they were a phase of upheaval. From traditional structures to colonial administrative and economic systems, the consequences of which are still felt today. Final thoughts. The history of the German colonies in the Pacific is a chapter that is often overlooked. Small compared to the great empires, but large in terms of what it reveals about power, prestige, and human aspirations. It shows how colonialism worked not only in Africa or Asia, but also on remote islands in the Pacific, and how even these small colonies were part of the global game for influence and recognition. Today, they remind us that even short episodes can leave deep scars, and that colonialism always writes stories of domination, exploitation, adaptation, and resistance.